Thank you for joining us for this virtual art talk in conjunction with Afsoon's solo exhibition, Searching for Myself in the Forest of Bewitchment, which is currently on view at ADVOCARTSY's West Hollywood Gallery through November 18, 2023. I'm Roshi Rahnama, the founder and director of ADVOCARTSY. Since 2015, ADVOCARTSY has dedicated its efforts to presenting works of artists of Iranian origin to museums, institutions, and collectors worldwide, with a permanent gallery in West Hollywood in the city of Los Angeles. In this interview, I'm happy to introduce Omid Arabian, who will be in conversation with Afsoon about her practice, the works exhibited in this exhibition, and her process. ADVOCARTSY has had the pleasure of collaborating with Afsoon since 2017, when we presented her work for the first time in our Art Brief 3 public initiative program, from which LACMA acquired 4 works from her Persian Expression series. A self-taught artist, Afsoon spent her childhood in Iran and youth in California before settling in London in 1988. Her nomadic life is reflected in her work, where East emerges with West, and the result is simultaneously familiar and foreign. Working across mediums, including photography, linocut, collage, and etching, Afsoon's practice aims to preserve her cultural past and explore nostalgia through visual storytelling and iconography. Her art reveals the introspective and often difficult nature of being a woman artist in the Iranian diaspora, contending with historical allusions and the artist's own carefully crafted playful visual language. Afsoon has exhibited internationally, and her works are held in the collections of LACMA, the British Museum, the Pierre Bourget Yves Saint Laurent collection, and the Farjam collection, amongst others. And now I'm super grateful to welcome Omid Arabian, who is my dear friend and who is the director of YOUniversal Center, a nonprofit educational organization where he conducts courses on Persian mysticism and philosophy. His translations of Rumi poetry have been published in 3 volumes. He's also the author of 3 children's books inspired by Rumi: The Heart's Garden, The Donkey's Gone, and the just published You Are Everything. Without further interruptions, I welcome Afsoon and Omid Arabian to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Roshi, and hello to all of you, and hello, Afsoon. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and truly an honor. I want to start by just saying that I saw the exhibit recently at ADVOCARTSY, and it truly moved me. I thought the sense of playfulness and whimsy that is in so much of your work was powerfully on display, and it made it a joy to be present among these works and to see really the universe that you've created. I also felt that at the same time it spoke to some very big subjects and themes. And I wanted to start by asking you just about your work in general, and how you find inspiration and intention when you start working on a piece or perhaps on a series, if you can tell us more about that.
I'm so happy to be talking with you, John. Well, the work usually starts with words. I'm addicted to reading. I read all sorts of stuff. I read poetry, biography, history, lots of fiction, lots of obscure stuff, and something triggers. Oh, it could be a word, it could be a line of poetry, it could be an image, in a novel, and then it sort of triggers me to kind of get deeper into finding out more about what is it that that interests me, and then I'll start researching the work. Most of my work is actually hugely research based, and by reading more about stuff that then I start imagining, and I find like almost images starts arriving in my head as I read, and then that's how the series starts. And then I, as a collage artist, I use a lot of kind of fun imagery, because, like, for example, I could do watercolor and paper collage, or lino art and paper collage. So then I start looking for material. I start looking for, it could be old postcards, it could be fragments of fabric, it could be family photographs. I'm a mega collector. I'm an absolute hoarder of things, other people's things. I love old things. So they all arrive, and then the last stage is actually making the artwork.
Amazing. Can you speak a little bit further about the relationship of stories to your work? Because particularly in this series, but also I know in your work in general, the idea of stories and storytelling is so present and so central. And I would love to know more about how that process works and what is your relationship to these stories.
I think if I lived like 200 years ago, I'll be one of those old ladies who would just sit by a fire and would just tell stories day and night. I love telling stories. People who know me socially, they know that I always sort of crack jokes or tell all these things that has happened. And so I try to bring that into my work. I find my work it's very figurative, as you know, and it's sort of almost an extension of me. It's telling the stories that I want to tell. As I said earlier on, you know, I read things. I read a lot of stories, and I also write short stories. So this is just a continuation of that. The stories that I have inside me, they come out and they take forms, and they could be a lino, or it could be a watercolor, or it could be a photo I've taken, and sort of take a life of their own, and they leave me. So I've always it's just something I have in me, just having to tell the stories.
Wow. So some of the stories are your own, and then some of the stories are, of course, taken or drawn from folk tales and mythologies and those kinds of things, right? And so I'm also interested on how you kind of come across these stories, what your research process is with stories that are pre-existing. Some of them seem to be kind of more popular. Some of them are a little bit more obscure, culturally speaking. So yeah, if you can say more about where you find these stories and how you kind of come across them, and how you bring them into your work.
Well, for example, I did a series about Persian expressions. I grew up with a family of poets and writers, and we used a lot of expression when I was a kid. And like my father would say something and my uncle would answer back in an expression. So as an older person, I met up a lot of younger Iranians, and I realized these expressions are not used anymore. And so I took it upon myself to kind of preserve that. So I started sort of researching old expressions, Persian expressions, and put them all together. And I made a series inspired by these expressions. So that's how I kind of like, just something triggers and it becomes something else. With fairy tales, I'm an absolute fan of fairy tales, folk tales, mythology, folk songs. I think these will say a lot about a culture. And people always look down at these things and they're not intellectual enough. To me, they're in essence of a culture, an essence of a real people of that culture. So I've been reading fairy tales all my life. Even adult, I still read fairy tales from around the world, not just Persian one. But Persian ones are very special because a lot of it speaks to me, like, because I kind of recognize where they come from, their emotions, their feelings, and the stories. For this exhibition, Searching for Myself, in a Forest of Bewitchment, I went back and reread a lot of my childhood fairy tales and folk tales, and I rediscovered things. And I've been reading these periodically throughout the years, but suddenly I was finding more things, as if like I was blind before. I said, how come I did not see this?
Mm.
And I think that's the gift stories have, depending on your age, your state of mind, where you are in the world or in your life. They keep giving, and you keep finding things in them.
Yeah. Beautiful. And of course, we know the power that folk tales and stories like this and mythologies and even fairy tales have to help us communicate very, very big ideas to each other across generations even. But also they start to become points of communication and connection between different cultures. They start to kind of allow us to speak across lots and lots of space and time, even to cultures that we may not have direct contact with, because the language that they use is so beautifully symbolic, and that symbolism really kind of cuts across any specific language that might divide us. It's actually a connective language, right? So I'm curious how, for you, how easy or difficult it might be to take something that is ultimately expressed verbally and take away that verbal layer, dig deep into the symbolism of it, and then translate it into something that is purely visual, as your works are. How does that work?
It's funny. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly how. It just happens. It just happens organically. I think you're quite the same all over the world. I've had traveled a lot throughout my life, and I find people that they laugh at the same joke and they understand the same pain.
Yeah.
And we actually tell the same story.
Yeah.
We're all one. And I think with the case of making art, of course, I was born in Iran. I lived in Iran till I was a teenager, but I've lived in the West for most of my adult life, for very, very, very many years. But still, Iran comes out. But in a way, the West also comes out. I'm a kind of a hybrid of both. I'm made of all this, both Iranian and non-Iranian sort of particles. But they are, when I tell a story visually, it's not just for Iranians, or it's not just for the English, or it's not just for the Americans, it's for everyone, because everyone can relate to the stories that we tell. Like, as you perfectly mentioned it when we last talked, Joseph Campbell told this wonderful story that he heard this myth of, I think it was First Nation, and then years later he had one from South Pacific, almost identical type, identical, and he realized how close we are, how similar we are as people. So the stories that I tell speaks to other people, hopefully. I don't know if that's exactly what you asked, but I'm not sure.
No, that's beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, and I just imagine that taking something that, again, has been expressed by a series of words for so many different centuries, sometimes even as some of these stories go way, way back, but then bringing it and saying it in language that is nonverbal entirely must not be an easy process. But you're telling me that just comes to you naturally, and as the story forms an image in your mind, basically, and then you just kind of bring that out into the work, and it doesn't have to be such an intellectual process, is what I'm understanding. Is that right?
Exactly like that. Like, poetry is a bit more complicated because we all feel different when we read a poem, because story is quite, has a beginning, middle, and end, and there are characters, and you know what's going on. So that's a simpler way. But with poetry, we get our own impressions. But I realized somehow it's so beautiful to use poetry, because it sort of enters us, and it sort of shows the way by itself. For this exhibition, I started reading Half-Baked Hare, and it was the first time I've actually read it, and I realized how beautiful Persian poetry is, how clever it is to show the multi-layer people, our minds, and our personalities. Because as we know the story, it's about the king Bahram, who wants to have a wife but ends up fall in love with 7 different images of 7 different women from around the world and marries all 7 of them. And when I was reading the poems, I just thought how fantastic these stories are. They speak to me now, a woman from the 21st century, 1,000 years gone by, and still the poems are relevant and so visual and I don't know, so accessible. Maybe the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a lot more than me about poetry, Omid. So you can tell me.
No, I'm with you. This is the power of poetry and of a language that is, even though it's verbal, it's symbolic and not literal. So the moment that you read something that is expressing whatever it wants to express through symbolism, that immediately connects, I think, with all of us, because that's a much more kind of integral and essential language for every single human being. And the moment that we connect with that, it evokes something in us, it awakens something in us. And then as an artist, I'm sure that that's one of the things that kind of you kind of hold on to and start to kind of work with and build upon. And we're looking at an image from your Half Pekar series, I think, and it really starts to speak about these women that are in that story by Nizami, and it really brings out, which I think is something I really wanted to get to, in fact, brings out the central role of women in that story, as you say, even though it's about a king, as it starts out anyway, but it really becomes about these women who take over not only the story, but the psyche of this king. They really become kind of the central elements in how he starts relating to the world and conducting himself. And I wanted to ask you, as a segue, in fact, about the presence of women, not just in your work in general, but in this specific show, because it seems to be very much filled with that energy of the women that are in these stories and in these myths. So can you speak more about this show in particular? I know that there's several different series that are represented within the show at ADVOCARTSY, but is it true that one of the central themes of the show is the presence of women in the works?
Yes, very much so. When I started planning for this solo show, was the uprising of the young Iranian women in Iran. And as I was watching this brave young female and male walking down the street, demanding their freedom, asking for things as is their right, I started kind of thinking of myself at that age. I started looking back, being a younger woman, and even younger, being a young little girl. What was I? What kind of woman? What kind of little girl I was? And the first thing came to my mind was all the things I was reading, because reading was a huge part of my childhood. And I decided, okay, I'm going to go back and reread everything that I was reading that time and try to find myself in the characters of those books that I was reading. And what I realized that in the past 40 years, the women being kind of wiped out of poetry, of stories, of what's coming out of Iran, really. It's almost becoming there in kind of a shadow in the background. But when we look back to what we've had in all these 1,000 years of literature, poetry, history, women has always played a very, very big part. And something I suddenly sort of triggered in my mind was that the storytellers were always women, the grandmothers or the nannies and the washwomen who washed clothes but also told the tale at the same time. They were all female most of the time, around the houses at least. And because a lot of them were illiterate, they were telling the stories, and the stories would sort of travel from one generation to another. And they used their female power and their voice by telling stories of other women and other female forces and voices. Yeah. So, and that was something I wanted to share in this exhibition. I wanted to bring those women out. I wanted to tell people, look, it's not just like we're in a shadow. No, it's not like that. We've been forefront in poetry, in history, and in a lot of tales.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's fascinating and so true for me as well that women were both the storytellers and then, as you say, naturally the heroines of so many of the stories. And it's a little bit sad to think that as we think and talk about stories throughout our history, we have tended to anyway focus more on the heroes and not so much the heroines. And to compensate for that, or at least to kind of start setting that right, it's incredible to start to bring out the fact that no, so many of these stories were about the women, and they really kind of took center stage, and they represented to us, such incredibly important ideas just by their presence, by their actions, by the way that they conducted themselves, and they showed us, what it's like to truly be somebody that takes charge of their own story, takes charge of their own narrative in the end. And I think that in the works that I was looking at in the series, this starts to really come out and really sort of remind us of something that could have been or can easily become forgotten, that role of the women. Sorry, go ahead. You wanted to speak to that also.
No, I agree with you because, like with the half-baked carrot we're talking about, I always thought it was about Bahram Agur. I thought, oh, this is like something to do with this great king. But actually, it's about his 7 wives, because each night that he will see a different one, which we need to add, they were from different parts of the world, and they were from different race and different background, and but they were all had one thing: they were all equal, and they were really wise. And each of them, by telling stories to the king, to their husband, the nights that they were spending with him, they were actually influencing him to how to rule Iran and how to rule his country, and what kind of a king he should become. I think we mustn't kind of read the book or kind of like by the cover of it. When I started digging in, I realized actually this is all about the 7 beauties.
Yeah, incredible. And it's a story about storytelling, which really makes it kind of doubly beautiful and impressive that it not only speaks about these women and their ability to tell the stories, but then the stories that they tell, each one of them becomes a world of its own and a universe of its own. And again, as I see the work here on screen, it's powerful to me to see that you've captured kind of these 7 characters in a way that makes one at least curious about, what is the story really about? And if we haven't heard the story, and even if we have somewhere back in our memory, it arouses to curiosity to go back to it and really see it now through the lens of these 7 women and what they're really representing in that story. So thank you for that. I think it's an important thing that you've done. I wanted to also ask you about other works and other series in the show. I know that there's a series of prints that's entitled the Ladyship series, and a very, very beautiful, there they are, with this incredibly, for me, evocative blue background and these images that you brought together in the collages. Can you speak a little bit more about this series and what it's about and how it ties in to the theme that you were talking about of women in the show?
Well, this is a very interesting little tale. Many years ago, I found a book, a Persian book, in a secondhand bookshop in London. It was only called Kitab Kuche, a street book, and it was put together by Ahmad Shamlu, the poet. But when I opened, I thought it was a poetry book. But when I opened the book, I realized these are just some obscure fairy tales that he had gathered from different books and put together for this book. This book was published outside Iran in the late 1980s. One of the stories that was found by a great Iranian scholar, I would think, called Sobhi, because he was a gentleman who went around Iran and collected tales. in the 1950s and 60s. It was one of the tales that he had found. And it was, it's a very short tale, but it's a very peculiar one, because it sort of works with sort of this. It's a story of an elderly woman who one day finds her sexual part, starts speaking and becoming very bossy. So she gets rid of it by cutting it off and throws it out of the house. And this bit of me gets picked up by a variety of people. So it starts a journey. And it's actually, we realize it's nothing. It's just a tiny little something, but has an incredible voice. And that voice, eventually through the story, by having first a soldier, then somebody hears about it, and the king finds out, and eventually marries, and through some sort of a magical thing, gains a body of a woman, becomes the queen. But what I found quite incredible about the story is actually a feminist tale. It tells you that you need your voice as a woman. What you need, all you need, is that voice to get you to where you want to go, to get what you want in life. And no one should kind of like stop you if you have that freedom within yourself. I found the story incredibly powerful, but at the same time, it's quite sexual. It's slightly kind of, in a way, it's written. It was it's not a written form. It was more like somebody told a story and they just taped her. I thought it was a sort of story like people would tell young girls before they were getting married, and to show them that you do have this power, you do have this sexual power, but it's more than that. It's not just about sex. So I sat on this story for almost 10 years because I was so just blown over by it. Eventually I translated it, I edited, because it's the way it's written in Persian was just like very oral, and made it into a little short story in English. And then I did this 8 pieces inspired by it. Again, it's not illustration. I don't illustrate things. I just let the story speak to me, and then it comes out somehow visually. And I'm very, if I have to say, all my work on my babies, but I really love her ladyship. And I decided to call her the kind of like, almost like a tale of traveling and finding yourself. So it's called The Adventures of Her Ladyship, because she goes through these adventures in order to find herself, which is, in the physical sense, finds the body of the woman, but also finds what she was after. In the story, she gains a king, but king is just symbolic. The king, for me, would be maybe an incredible museum show. For somebody else, would be a fantastic job or an incredible car or whatever. But it is using your power as a woman to reach where you want to go in life.
Yeah. And to find your position of sovereignty over your own life in this world, which is, I think, so important and so powerful. There's also an element to this series in particular, but I think to so much of your work in general as well, that has to do with archiving, right? This story, for example, is not a story that many of us have heard. And as powerful as it is, it's not something that would necessarily be familiar to a lot of us. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, part of what you're doing is helping these stories kind of be archived and be preserved, so that there is access, for future generations, and that they're not eventually kind of lost to history and kind of forgotten. Is it something that you do consciously in your general practice to make sure that things like this are not lost and are archived and are preserved, or is it something that just kind of happens as a byproduct of your work?
I think initially it was really the byproduct. It just happened naturally. I was just interested in old things, old tales and stuff, like what I said about the Persian expressions, and then they will become something else. But now, as I get older, I realize my generation, when we go, younger generation might not have access to a lot of these tales, and this is so much part of all of us. So yes, I like to preserve, and I like to actually kind of entice people into reading, into going out there and searching for these stories. For like during the opening at ADVOCARTSY for my show, I talked to a lot of young women actually, and told them some of the tales, the fairy tales that I was inspired for some of the pieces, and they were so shocked, and they were saying like, "Really, is that like an Iranian story? And what is it?" And some of them are mixed Iranian or not, and I thought, yes, but you mean you need to go and read them? They're wonderful. They're
Yeah.
not, they're out there, and you can find them online. There's some books, and I do hope that some of them get published
Yeah.
by organizations in the United States and be accessible, maybe even in translation in English,
Yeah.
because it's so much part of our culture and so much part of the people that we are. The way we have turned out, who we are, is
Yeah.
it's sort of we coming from a long line of women and becoming these young women that we are now.
Yeah.
So I hope so. I hope
I hope so too. That would be really fantastic.
Yes.
The series we're looking at right now also is something that really piqued my interest. This series seems to kind of not be based on specific tales, but rather it takes the iconography of fairy tales and the kind of archetypes, it seems to me, that are present in so many of our stories, and just kind of playfully presents them to us across different works within the series. And also it seems to incorporate not just collage, but there's some watercolor that you've used in them, if I understand it correctly. So can you speak a little bit more about both of these topics? One is just the idea of taking elements that are present in various stories and present them without an actual underlying specific tale. And then after that, if you can speak a little bit about the process of these works, and then eventually I want to ask about your process in general with your other works as well, please.
With this one, when you read a lot of these old tales, there are certain subjects that appears all again and again.
Yeah.
One is obviously war. There is another one which is about love. It's about seeking something.
Yeah.
For example, taking journeys in order to get to something you want. Another one I found was honesty and history, looking back and learning from your past experience. So these were like a very typical kind of like a essence of a lot of these stories. So I decided to just take these just general subject and make these collages around them. For example, we see war. The two people look at each other, and for that one, I just thought I quite like we can always start a war, because it's just that somehow wars happen in a lot of these tales,
Yeah.
and a lot of sort of also women going to find their men, going whether it's sort of like to find the king that is lost, the righteous one, the one that is they have a right to be a king, or they have a right to rule, or they have the right to be the correct husband. So I chose a very general ideas and play around with them.
Yeah.
With technique, well, I did a very brief, but I was just thinking about the ideas. I just did a very brief pencil drawing of how I wanted it, the shape of the bodies. I did their faces and their hands and legs with watercolor, and then I had basically almost like a big piece of white paper with very little watercolor, and then I started cutting. My favorite object in my studio is my scissors. I love my scissors, so I started cutting and cutting. And I usually I find very old things to cut, but I don't cut the original. I have them scanned and printed on a nice paper, and then I cut those. So I got a lot of like old magazines from the 70s and stuff, images from there. That's why you get a kind of a nice orangey sort of soft colors. Then I cut millions of pieces. I mean, like a mountain, but I know exactly what I cut. I mean, I know even something like this big. and I know where that one's going to go. And then I just play around, and I play around, and it can take days and days and days and days. I take pictures and I wait. The next day, I decide what goes on the back, what goes in front, and I eventually it says itself says it's ready, and then I glue.
You had me at 70s. That's my favorite decade. So, and you're right, that glow, that kind of orangey warmth that I associate also with the 70s comes through very, very beautifully. So many of the works in the show are collages, but within that you have so many different techniques and media that you work in. You have not only watercolor, but there's acrylic, there's works on canvas, there's lino cuts, there are prints, there's textile and sewing even. And yeah, I wanted to just hear a little bit more about these various media and how you work with them and how you incorporate, you decide which ones to bring in on which pieces and within which series.
I don't know. That kind of happens organically. I don't really sit and decide, okay, this one has to be like that. With the fairy tales, because I was thinking of the women, I decided that I actually want to do a lino. So I started cutting linos, and it just sort of came just like that. And what I do is these we just saw earlier on some of my background pieces. So I first need to decide on a paper. I'm very particular with the paper I use. I always seek really good artist papers from around the world, really. For the fairy tales, I chose this and German paper called Zarkat. I had these talisman, old talisman, but that's one of the things I collect. I collect old amulets and talismans from around the world, but a lot from Iran. So I chose one very old one that belonged to my grandmother. So I had it photographed and I had it printed on the Zarkat paper, as we can see now. And then that became the background. On top of that, then I printed on separate papers. I printed the linos. I use a lot of colors. For people that are not familiar with lino cut and lino printing, the more the colors, much more complicated it gets, because you need to match the colors when you put the lino on top of the paper. It needs to match exactly like how you did, for example, in black. And then you need to do the lips, how it's going to go in that. So it's quite complicated. We won't go into that. But then I use like many different, like 4 or 5 color linos for those. So like weeks of preparation and weeks of printing.
Magical.
Yeah, but you can see some of the colorful ones. Yes, these are 2 colors and 3 color linos. For some of the other pieces, I chose some talismans. I only use talismans to do with women. As you can see, like in background is a woman riding a horse or a mule, and this one also, they're facing one another. And these are power talismans that women, when they wanted to reach something and gain something, they would have these talismans made, and they would maybe put it under their pillows, or they would bury it in the house, and they do some sort of magical stuff. Because one other subject I'm absolutely obsessed with is magic, and within the Islamic culture, the use of magic. So then I chose the background to go with talismans, and then on top of it, I would glue the linos, which I had printed separately.
Yeah.
With these ones, I actually did a similar thing, but this is on canvas. So I had the talismans printed on canvas, and then I painted. I had another canvas also printed with another talisman. Then I painted with acrylic on the other piece of canvas. Then I cut it up and I put it on the first background. So it's a combination of a lot of gluing, cutting, and pressing and flattening, because I quite like the 3-dimensional aspect of collage. Because these canvases, the paint, there's not only just one paint, but it actually just comes out. So it's layers of images.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just my own experience of looking at these works is that I get so lost in, the magic of them, and I don't consciously think about the process of making them, and how the artists yourself have done all this work, as you say, and all the layers that you have kind of gone through to create the work. But I think that's a testament to the work, because if it has that kind of power where you don't stand there and think, well, how did she do that, right? The first thing that comes through is just the magic, the energy, the power of the story that is being represented, that and the beauty of it. For me, that's really kind of a testament to how good the work is. But then to come back and then to think about and to talk about the underlying process just enriches the experience even more. So thank you for sharing that. You spoke about magic, which reminded me that you also have other series that are not necessarily in this show, but are related. You have a series called not just Persian magic, but there is a series called Egyptian magic and Moroccan magic. So, and these are, from my understanding, are also based on stories and fairy tales, but from those other cultures. There we go. We're looking at some examples. I wanted to ask you about these different series that are based upon and taken and drawing from different cultures, and what you found perhaps that was in common between these different stories from these different places, and what you found that might have been different across these various cultures that you researched and looked into.
Well, my magic series started with my residency in Morocco. I became very interested in their idea of magic. I was told about a kind of a female, very sexy woman who is present throughout Morocco. Her name is Aisha Kandisha, and she gets picked up by men in souks, in bazaars and places. And she's really sexy and smells beautiful and everything. And when she goes to bed with these men, the men realize that she's actually an evil she-devil kind of thing, because one of her legs is an animal leg. And they all go mad. So they, like, apparently in the asylum of Marrakesh asylum, mental asylum, over 60% of the men say that they are married to Aisha Kandisha. So this story kind of really intrigued me, and I started sort of following, trying to find out more what's about this woman, and from there, I found quite a few different tales, and again, I wrote it down, and when I came back to London, I did I think 12-piece series on Moroccan magic. Then I thought, what about other countries? It's just they have these ideas, because a lot of the kind of like the dodgy ones, as they say in England, are women who they do bad things, the kind of jinn, female jinn. So I then traveled to Egypt, and I did a whole bunch of research there. And what was interesting is that a lot of, even though the Moroccan ones are very much like a tales of Berber tales, mountain stuff. Egypt, even though it was desert, going back, almost some of the characters go back to pre-Islamic. They kind of like use some of the elements of the gods and goddesses of pre-Islamic period. They kind of shared very similar personalities and ideas with the Moroccan one. Then I thought, what about Iran? For Iran, I had to do my research online. I joined a lot of forums which they talk about magic and about jinn. They actually are online forum that people write their problems. I think they have jinn inside them, and then they write the questions, and there's this Mullah jinn, anti-jinn person would discuss what they should be doing. And also I ordered a lot of books from Qom, city of Qom in Iran, about magic. So I brought all those to London, and I did my Persian one. Persian one, of course, had a lot of elements of very Iranian things, a lot of like wells and things falls into wells, and which you do not get in Morocco or in Egypt. But essentially, it's quite similar. Water plays a very big part. If you see a woman next to a river late at night, you better not go near her, because that's the end of you. And that's in all these cultures. So I found that quite fascinating, that how they how we are, as we were saying, how we are so similar. And even though these cultures, like 3 completely different cultures. also what I like to add here, because I think it might be kind of interesting for the viewers, is the element of how storytelling, how we really blend into our surrounding. With Aisha Kandisha, I was told, like, if Aisha Kandisha is picked up in a city, her leg is a dog leg. If a man in a village has picked up Aisha Kandisha and claims to be in love with her and has gone to bed with her, her leg was a goat leg. And the men from the desert, they said, no, it wasn't a goat. It was actually a camel leg. So, and I see that a lot in fairy tales as well, depending on where you are. Like if a story takes place like in Azerbaijan of Iran, the fruit of the special fruit is a pomegranate. But if it goes into Khuzestan, it's a date. So people who told the stories, they only knew about the area around them. And they kind of like, even though it's universal, the subject, but it's also very personal. Yes. So I think that's one of the things I love about finding stories, the same stories from different parts or from different countries. They're essentially the same stories, but we add our own little flavor to it.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful note perhaps to close on, if I may, because the idea of the personal and the universal and how they relate to each other and how they can be present both at the same time, as we see, as you say, through these stories and these story collections across cultures, reminds us that in life as well, these two dimensions are always present. The personal is present, the universal is present, but we're often more tuned into the personal because we live inside our heads a lot and our own space, both literally and symbolically. But letting that scope, kind of our vision, expand a little bit to become more aware of the universal element, I think is something that is sorely needed, especially in our world today. And so I thank you for helping that universal element come out through these creations and through these stories that you're telling and through these exhibitions, of course, that ADVOCARTSY and other art institutions are putting on. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the art world. I personally certainly feel that, for helping us kind of expand our vision beyond just the personal to something that is much broader and more universal. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
And Roshijan, if you're there, I want to thank you as well. And to those who are watching this also, thank you for your time and your attention. And if you want to learn more about Afsoon, about ADVOCARTSY, all the information I'm sure will appear at the end of this clip. And I encourage you to go and look into all of that, as well as stories. Please, please, please surround yourself with stories, because life is a lot less rich without them.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Cheers.
Thank you.